Welcome back everyone. So coming up we've got Phil Minns, who's the Senior Inspector for Early Curriculum from Ofsted, and he's going to give you an update about what's been happening with them. So I'm sure you'll find this informative.
Hello and welcome to this update from Ofsted. My name's Phil Minns. I'm a Senior His Majesty's Inspector and I work in the early education part of our curriculum unit, where we spend a bit more time looking at the detail of the curriculum and the contents of the areas of learning. So in this next sort of half an hour, I'm going to be covering the impact of COVID, just giving you a sort of update on our most recent research about how that's been impacting on young children. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the importance of communication and language, and that's from some work that we've been doing and sharing more widely recently through a series of roadshows that we've been doing. And then lastly, I'm going to share with you some very recent Ofsted research, which has only just been published, and I'll just give you some of the headlines from that research. Okay, so I'll make a start thinking about the impact of COVID. And towards the end of 2020, we published a series of COVID-19 themed briefings, which presented findings from research interviews that we've been carrying out with early years providers. It was one in a series. We've been looking since the beginning, really, of the pandemic and finding out what people thought. And you can imagine that providers had concerns about the financial impact, the impact that the restrictions were having on children's PSED, and also the deterioration of some behaviour in some children when they returned. What I'm going to do is just give you sort of the highlights or the key messages for children under 2 and then over 2, and then I'll tell you a little bit about some of the changes in practice that we've seen. So when we're looking at children who are under 2, clearly people were telling us that there are concerns about communication and language, that children are coming in without the same level of knowledge and confidence in their language and communication as they would have had pre-pandemic. Children have been struggling to separate from parents, and they are more cautious around unfamiliar adults, and also practitioners are telling us that they can see delays in some of the physical skills. It's really important, and one of the things that we talk about when we discuss this with providers is that we need to remember that these things are, some of them will be the natural result of pandemic and the lockdowns. So things like struggling to separate from parents. Children would usually do that when they're starting nursery, perhaps when they're 18 months, 2 years old. Now perhaps they're starting nursery when they're closer to 3. So they're going to struggle to separate from their parents at that point, rather than having tackled it when they're 2. So it's not that they haven't, it's not some sort of delay, or it's not sort of hinting at a special educational need. It's simply that they haven't had to learn how to do that yet. And one of the things that we encourage practitioners to do is see these sorts of things as, when you see those things that those children are struggling with, think about it in terms of they haven't learned to do this yet, rather than thinking, oh, there is a problem or a difficulty. Because, for example, with some of the delays in physical skills, when children weren't able to get out, when we know that some places where children were blocks of flats, where there weren't those sort of same opportunities to exercise, those children did have some delays in their physical skills because they weren't able to access the things that were helping them to develop them. So it's really helpful to think about it in that terms of they haven't learned to do it yet, and think about then what we can do to help them to learn those things. When we're looking at children who are over 2, it's a similar picture actually, and basically it's a big message about children being behind in the prime areas, behaviour and social skills, and also independence skills aren't where they would have been had the pandemic not happened. And again, some of those things we need to be cautious that we don't think, oh, this is a child who's got issues with this particular aspect of social skills or independence. It might simply be that they haven't had to learn it. They haven't been through that process of learning. And so we just need to bring that forward, recognise that there's a gap, that there's something that they don't understand or can't do, and then see the different ways that we can help them to learn it. We have seen some changes in practice and procedure, the whole sort of kiss and drop process where parents haven't been coming on site, and some of that continued quite a time after COVID, after the restrictions were in place, and part of that settings told us was to do with the worries that they had about staff illness. So they maintained some of those things to try and keep their staff healthy, so they had them on site, because they'd show, they've all experienced problems and difficulties with staffing, and they've lost some good staff during COVID, and then they were struggling to keep them. Some of the settling in processes that weren't being delivered in the same way, because parents weren't coming on site. And there's some concern there with both of these things, that could be affecting the partnership that settings have with parents. From our point of view, we don't see any of these things as good or bad in themselves. It's about the impact they have on the education the children receive. So is the fact that you're continuing to kiss and drop, how are you mitigating those difficulties that inevitably will come up when children aren't seeing their parents in the setting with them? And that's often the easiest time to communicate with parents. So it's just considering how that might be happening if you've not got that situation. What are you doing to mitigate those difficulties and make sure that you do have good relationships with parents and that you've got that backwards and forwards communication going on? So there's just a few things from the research that we've been doing and looking at the impact of the pandemic. And as I said, that's been mostly from conversations with providers, and also the information that our inspectors find out whilst they're on inspection. But now I want to move on to the importance of communication and language. And this is a series. I've given you a very brief part of a much bigger piece of work that we've been doing, that originated with some work that to train our inspectors, that came as a result of the changes to the EYFS that happened recently, and then we've turned that piece of work into a roadshow that we've been sharing with providers across the country, and we've done a series of those, and we'll be continuing to do some more of those probably early in the new year. So as this slide says, vocabulary size is really, really important. A good vocabulary not only allows you to communicate effectively, but it also enables you to understand what's going on around you, what people are saying, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. We need to remember that for a child who doesn't have the vocabulary, the language and communication skills of others, they're going to struggle to understand the stories that are being read to them. They're not going to understand the instructions that are being given out. And there's so many things that will affect how well they can get on. And in the much bigger picture, as this slide sort of sums up, there's many studies and much research that shows the correlation between vocabulary size and success later on. So, a child who is 4 with a limited vocabulary is much less likely to do well academically as they travel through school, but they're also twice as likely to be unemployed by the time they're 34. So it's really significant, and it's really right that we focus on communication and language right from the very beginning, particularly because, as it now says in the revised EYFS, and this is a direct quote from that revised EYFS, communication and language underpins all 7 areas of learning. And this goes on then actually as children get older, because when children enter Key Stage 1, the national curriculum also states that pupils' spoken language should be developed as an integral part of each subject. So it really identifies the importance of communication and language, and clearly it's one of the prime areas of learning. So this slide simply paraphrases, if you like, the contents of the educational programme for communication and language. All I've done is reduce it down and put it into bullet points, and you can see that it starts to become, you can see those different elements of how children develop their speech and language and communication, starting off with back and forth interactions, between adults and babies that become that sort of very early form of conversation, acquisition of new vocabulary, whether that's single words or more developed, learning more complicated words, the need for a frequent exposure for children to books and extensive occasions to use and embed new words, because books and stories and songs and rhymes just give children so much information. And the last one on here about the opportunities that children have to become comfortable using a rich range of vocabulary and language structures. And perhaps that's the one that gets least attention. Sometimes there's a move away from communication and language. We're very clear that prime areas of learning are part of the curriculum that children should get, because that's part of the EYFS requirements. Throughout the EYFS, there is no point at which you sort of leave communication and language behind and transfer into literacy. And we wonder if sometimes that's where this bottom bullet point gets lost, because of a greater focus on literacy, and moving into some things that don't need to be tackled until children get into school. But this idea that children become comfortable using rich language vocabulary and language structures, that's really important, that they have, they get to say them, because otherwise what happens is they don't get enough practice of hearing more complicated things and saying more complicated things before they get to then being expected to read or write those more complicated things. And it's really important that children have the chances to, to be able to retell a sequence of events, orally, before they're being expected to write things in that way. So that bottom one is something that's really worth giving some attention to and remembering. When we get into literacy, I think the way that the literacy is now written is much clearer. It does say it's crucial for children to develop that lifelong love of reading, but it also very conveniently, if you like, breaks down reading and writing into its parts. Reading is language comprehension and word reading, and writing is transcription and composition. Now, word reading, for most children, that's going to be the skills they learn in phonics when they reach their reception class and then go on to year 1 and year 2. There is no reason for those word reading skills, the phonics, to be taught before children reach reception. It's much more useful for them to have a focus on language comprehension, being able to hear and say and learn lots of different words so they understand what they mean. Because that's an equally important part of reading, and some would argue a bigger part of reading, because you can learn those phonics reasonably quickly and get them under your belt. And then, of course, you're using the phonics to work out what this word in front of me says, how to read this word, and then once I've read it, I need to know what it means. That's where language comprehension comes in. So there's a real need to focus on language comprehension, which of course is inbuilt in communication and language. And equally, when we look at writing, transcription is that very sort of basic skill, if you like, of being able to write letters in response to the sounds and be able to transcribe those sounds and words. That's again something that we wouldn't expect to see until children are in reception. But the other part there, the sort of bigger part of writing, rather than simply the physical process of being able to turn what you think into what you want to write, is the composition, that sort of mental process of deciding what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. That again falls entirely into communication and language. So a focus on communication and language means that you're dealing with half of these things already. You're going to have a language comprehension focus and you're going to have a composition focus. And by looking at language comprehension and composition before children become readers and writers, it gives them the head start that many other children already enjoy, because they have the chance to come up with ways of saying things and understanding what's going on around them. Now, there's some real dangers of missing knowledge. This sort of Jenga block is trying to illustrate that, showing, we get these gaps at the bottom in the foundation, and those are the things that will come back and create an unsteady foundation of learning, and then the learning will rock and potentially fall later on. And that's where the foundation stage is so important. It's called the foundation stage for a purpose, isn't it? It's because it is what children build their later learning on. It's why when we look at things like comprehension and composition, it's really important that children get that when they're young so that they can build on it. Some children will be coming in to settings already with those abilities. Some children enjoy the advantage of having an awful lot of talk and discussion and listening to stories and looking at interesting things and asking questions and having questions asked of them, and that gives them an advantage when they arrive in the setting, because they've got all of that experience and knowledge of communication and language. But not every child enjoys that advantage, and so we really need to look then to make sure those children who don't have the same advantages, we help them to pick those up. And that's where this focus on communication and language can really help, particularly for those youngest children. Because if they go on into Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 2 and beyond, without a good understanding of vocabulary, without the comprehension of what's being said around them, of course, that will make it much more difficult for them to do well as they grow and develop later on. So just drawing this second section to a close, it's really important to remember that the EYFS provides the skeleton here. You know, the EYFS, the programs that are set down there, the areas of learning, that's the skeleton of what needs to be taught for children between the ages of 0 and 5, and what children need to learn is set down in there. But it's reasonably brief, and that gives providers and schools the opportunity to build on that. So we would say that the EYFS provides the skeleton of what children have got to learn, but it's up to providers to put their flesh on the bones there, to make sure that they add into it what their children need. A second message here: knowing what you want children to learn makes it easier to decide how to get it across. That's a really important thing to remember. And that's why we would always argue that you start with the curriculum, which just simply sets out what you want children to learn. And then you move on to all of your pedagogy and how you're going to get that across. So, how you're going to teach it, you decide after you've decided what you want those children to learn. That makes life a lot easier for the adults working with children, and also for the children, because there's a clearer understanding of what children have got to learn at any point. And the last point here is just going back to that message that I had before about comprehension and composition are being really important, and that those should be a really good focus in communication and language, giving children the chance to hear and learn to understand more complicated words, and probably a lot of that comprehension activity will happen through interactions with adults, and also with the stories, rhymes, songs, the books that are shared. That's a really good vehicle for those. And then composition, again, this is going to be a lot of it through interactions with adults, talking about what's going on, adults demonstrating that, being able to, commentate on something that's happening or explain something to children. So children hear those models of composition, and then they're able to produce them themselves, making it easier for those children to learn the things that they need to learn. So there's quite a lot to talk about with communication and language, so it's always difficult to fit it into these sort of short sessions. But before I finish, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of the findings of our recently published research review, where we're beginning to look at our conception of quality for early years. It was published on the 14th of November, so hopefully what this will do is give you a little taster, and then you can find out more by reading the whole thing. So this slide sets out the first 3 sections of this first part of our research review. You'll see that we're looking at the broad context of children from birth to 4, looking at the sort of places they attend, and the second, looking at ambition for all. And when we talk about ambition for all, we're really talking about the extent to which the curriculum considers what all children need to learn, and the fact that it gives lots of opportunities for children who are disadvantaged or who speak English as an additional language to learn and practice speaking and listening. Then we go on to look at staffing in the early years sector, and you'll see there's a range of sections in there to do with the early years workforce, ratios, and then CPD, and it picks up some of the issues around those at the moment. And the last section on this third bullet point on this slide in front of you are the principles behind this research review. And basically, those principles are the ones that exist for all of the research reviews that we've done up until this point. Most of those have been done on subjects in the national curriculum, and this is the first one that looks at early years and the EYFS. But what we do is we set down the principles that all of this research and the selection of research is based upon. This slide, which is the last section of the report, looks at some of the bigger issues perhaps that cover all areas of learning before we go on to look at individual areas of learning in the next 2 parts of this 3-part research review. So in part 1, we just look at these overarching issues, whilst in parts 2 and 3 we'll go on to look at the actual areas for learning that are set out in the EYFS. So when we look at the curriculum, we consider cultural capital and just the importance of knowing what children know already when they arrive with you and starting points. Then we go on to look at some of these areas of teaching in the early years. So the first one being executive function, which is also known as cognitive control. And it refers to the mental processes that begin to develop from birth and are considered essential for learning, as well as for cognitive, social, and psychological development. Researchers in cognitive science agree that there are three core areas of executive function. So inhibition, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. So, inhibition being that the development of self-control of behavior and attention. Working memory being that the ability to hold information in mind and to work with it. And then cognitive flexibility, which is about changing your approaches to a problem and being able to switch between tasks. So we go into more detail there about what executive function is and the implications for early years. And then we go on to play. We identify and recognize that it's essential for children's development. We recognize that children will be leading their own play, they'll be taking part in play, and they'll be involved in play that's guided by adults. We're clear that play is an important and enjoyable part of children's early education. And we go on to think about how, when planning for play, practitioners should consider whether children are learning something new or are consolidating previous learning. And that with play, thinking about what children already know can help practitioners know how much adult support and guidance the child might need in that play. If children are learning something for the first time, they're going to need much more help. And actually, that's where we come on to that last bullet point there, the role of explicit teaching, where, generally we'd be saying if children are coming across something for the first time as something they can't do, then sometimes there's a role for explicit teaching, actually just showing them or guiding them or helping them to be able to do that new thing that they can't do. We finish the report with got here 7 key messages, and these are the sort of findings, if you like, that based on the research, this is what high quality curriculum and pedagogy might have as the features, if you like, of high quality curriculum and pedagogy. So we'll just run through these. The first one there about the curriculum considering what all children need to learn and offering them plenty of opportunities, particularly children who are disadvantaged or who speak English as an additional language, to learn and practice speaking and listening. Then we've got that point about practitioners choosing activities and experiences once they know what they want children to learn. And that those most appropriate activities and experiences then will help to secure that intended learning. Then we go on to say, adults think carefully about what children already know and can do when deciding what to teach first or next. So that real solid understanding of children's prior knowledge. And then identifying that children who've got gaps in their knowledge, when we're looking at these indicators of quality, those children would get the additional teaching they need so that they can access the same curriculum as their peers. If they don't share the same amount of knowledge as others, then they won't be able to engage in the activities that are out in front of them. So they might need some extra help there. And then we talk about practitioners considering a child's interest when choosing activities and using that to expand children's interests and make sure that children develop and progress in all 7 areas of learning. Then we've got the fact that children's play is valued and it's used to teach many aspects of the curriculum, and that learning through play is enhanced by skillful adult intervention. And lastly, we're just talking about the role of explicit teaching and that it can be used to introduce children to new knowledge and then be followed up with practice in a variety of ways, perhaps through play or other ways. So hopefully you found this session interesting and useful. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.